Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we speak with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Nicolas Carlo, who joins us from Montreal, Canada. Nicolas is the author of UnderstandLegacyCode.com and is currently a senior tech lead at BusBud. Nicolas Carlo, welcome to Maintainable.
Yeah, hi Robby. I'm glad to be here.
So as you reflect on your time in the industry, what do you believe are a few common traits that a software application's code base is being well maintained?
Well, good question. Maintainable code base to me will be one with like a good README first, so I can get into it very easily. I can have it running locally quickly. I can do changes, so I will have test to tell me if the things is working or not, so I can do changes. And it will be also easy to deploy. So the speed for me as a newcomer to that code base to get into it, do a change, ship it, get it delivered, that will be a good measurement for me of that code base is well maintained or not.
When you're talking about deploying, is that to like a production environment or staging type environments or?
Yeah, any of the above. Well, ultimately to production at least. If there are more, that depends case by case. Ideally, it should be easy for me to discover that. So documentation might be related to that, or at least having access to that knowledge. Then how to do that, it really depends. That can come to in very different flavors. But at the end, being able to jump on the project and be productive as soon as possible without breaking things, that will be my key measurement of it's maintainable.
Do you often use the term technical debt in your day-to-day work?
Yeah, we do use it, although it's a convoluted word sometimes. Yeah, sometimes people say technical debt to mean like code that is not like bad code, maybe. Just like they say refactor when they instead want to say redesign or change completely the way it's working. So I try not to abuse technical debt. When I use technical debt, I mean something we have decided consciously that we will not do the perfect way, but we're taking a shortcut for the moment and we will revisit later. So that will be my use of the technical debt.
And when you talk about, you're making like a short-term trade-off there, do you find that you found some good patterns for how to come back and actually do that versus making it, say, wishful thinking that you're going to come back around and have the time to do that?
Yeah, that's so. For example, we're developing features at work. Some of them are really new, so we don't really know if that will actually work or not, and what to do. So we're taking shortcuts here on the when we have discussion with the business. We try to go for the simplest scenario, and we say, okay, we're gonna take some shortcuts here for the implementation, so we can release as soon as possible. But we make it clear, for example, that if it works and we want to go for the full thing, then it will take us more time because we need to revisit what we have implemented. And so what we do concretely is we write that down in the issue, like we're using GitHub issues for work, but we track that. So we know that it's clear with the business that when we need to move on, there are all of these decisions, all of these shortcuts that we need to pay.
I'm curious because you mentioned earlier on about being well maintained. Do you find that when you're, say, working towards that, maybe, I don't know if you're using like a minimum viable product type of approach for like some of those features that the business is curious about, they want to see if it works in, in whatever capacity that application is trying to serve that business. But are there some aspects to taking those shortcuts that are kind of directly at odds with the traits of a healthy and maintainable code? Like what are some common things? Do you take shortcuts like not bother writing tests, or do you feel like that's still an important thing to do early on?
Usually, so I'm speaking about implementing new features in an existing product. So in that case, all of the heavy lifting of having tests in place have been done. So we have that already. So writing new tests when we write code doesn't take us much more time, and it usually pays off. So we don't skip the test. This is not the kind of thing. Even when we want to go fast, it's more on the implementation. So in the number of scenario and edge cases we're handling. So usually what we will do is we will not handle a lot of scenarios. We will just handle the simplest scenarios. And of course, that allows us to do a simple test and have a very simple, naive implementation. So the implementation will be really naive, and it won't work when we want to scale or when we need to handle more bus operators, because we're dealing with a lot of bus operators. But that's where we do the cut. So it doesn't really impact the maintainability of the thing. Although there is a trade-off on maybe the documentation or the automation part. That's true that when we start, we don't automate much. Like for example, the new scripts or whatever needs to be created, we start doing them manually first. And it's only when we reflect and we know where we are going that we're gonna automate the thing, so it's easier for someone else to jump into it. So that will be the trade-off.
I see. And are those typically things you would be doing in like, you mentioned you're using GitHub issues and things like the track things. Are you doing those in like specific branches? And then do you often find yourself merging things into your primary? I'm not sure what you name your branches there, but do those branches tend to have some of those shortcuts? And then do you try to clean that up before you get that kind of pushed out to production? Or do you just know that there's going to be some issues you're going to have to come back later and tackle?
The way we use GitHub today, it looks maybe more like open source than like I used to work on bigger project where we have like a master dev and then all the branches for different environments. What we do is that we have feature branches that merge into master, and we try to keep the feature not last too long. So usually, for example, for one issue, we will have multiple pull requests. So we will integrate frequently. And when I say frequently, I mean multiple times a week. When I work on a branch, I will usually get that merge in 2 days back in master. So how do we do that? Because we're coding, but we cannot just finish the feature in 2 days. But we're using a lot of like feature toggling, for example, when we start working. So we do use that. It's really easy to forget to clean up these feature toggles. So when it comes to maintainability and the trade-off, this is a trade-off. We do feature toggling when we start working, but at the end we also have an issue to clean up the feature toggle. Either we adopt or we reject. But that way we're able to merge into master frequently. So we do have branches. They don't last too long.
Nice. It sounds like a good and efficient way to manage that. I know that there's the challenge that developers often face where you're working on features for a while and maybe you're kind of jumping in and out of it, and then it's like the great merge at some point that has to happen, and you're like, okay, this isn't gonna cleanly merge now, and like what are these other people been working on, and trying to like match all that up can be definitely a big challenge. So I'm always curious how people are managing that effectively in different environments. And it sounds nice, and it's always like one of those things. I haven't seen it done well in a lot of the projects that I've been part of, but I'm definitely curious about it and talk about it more with my own team. So, you earlier touched on how technical debt can be, say, a loaded word, and sometimes it's being used, maybe abused as a phrase by developers. And you mentioned maybe talking about bad code or things that they disagree with. What have you seen some ineffective ways that developers have tried to explain why things needed to be changed that was maybe what kind of aligned with what you see, how you would call technical debt, that to effectively get the product owners, stakeholders, people with the budgets to approve making some changes that might not seemingly make a big difference to, say, the customers or clients' user experience, but underneath the hood, there's going to be make a bigger impact. How have you seen that done effectively?
So this week at BusBud, we're doing what we call a sustainability week, which is a moment where engineers from all of the different squads, all of the different teams collaborate together, and we're tackling what we will call technical debt. Well, we do mostly maintenance work and related from business concerns and that kind of thing. So we're exactly in that moment where that kind of work, that's also a way for us to make sure that we keep doing that, even if people don't do that in teams. So I started working on something because I noticed that on my code base, or integration tests, they're so using the database, but they don't clean up the database between each test, which would be a good practice to make sure that all of the tests are independent from each other. Like when one test fails, it doesn't pollute the other tests as we have. So I wanted to do that. And in terms of business value, my argument is that it will make a developer more efficient, because today, when you have to write an integration test, you need to think about cleaning the database yourself, and cleaning the database means you need to do that in the correct order because of the foreign key constraints and all of that. So I wanted to automate all of that so people don't have to think about it anymore, and I started to do that, and then I realized that I spent 3 hours, like half a day on it. And I realized that more than 50% of our tests were actually depending on that behavior, the data being persisted. So I stopped and I think again about that, because I had actually two issues. First, every time people want to clean up the database, they need to do it again, and they need to figure out what needs to be clear in what order. So that was not really efficient. And then there is this, the test might be coupled. But it turns out that it would be too much work for me to spend to clean up all of these tests. It's 2,500 tests, which is 50% of our test suite. So we have 5,000 tests. So that will be an insane amount of tests to clean up, and that doesn't worth it for the business. So I changed my goal, and now what I'm doing is just I have one function that clean up the database and anyone can call. So it's not perfect, but I'm happy that I was able to think about the business value of what I was doing. If I was just focused on, okay, this is not great, it's not the way you do things in an ideal world, and I want to resolve that debt, I would spend weeks, maybe just days, but probably weeks on trying to solve that issue that doesn't really bring value. The money I will be paid to do that for the company, it will be a waste. So it happens that sometimes as developers, we focus on a problem, on a technical issue, and we forget to stop sometime and think about the return on investment, if you want. And sometimes situations are not great, especially on existing code. Things are not the way you would like them to be. But the thing is, fixing that maybe is not worth it. So thinking about technical debt and arguing with people from the business value, you really need to think hard on, okay, why is it really a problem beyond being not ideal? Is it really a problem? What kind of issues is it causing? And what is the impact for personal developer productivity? But at the end, it has an impact on the company budget and on the end user, what you are able to deliver as features. So it's hard, it's a fine balance, but I think it's very valuable for developers to think about the outcome for the company and the end user mostly.
That makes sense. And when you're thinking about that type of challenge where you see that there's maybe a mismatch or a consistency maybe within those tests, though, where you've got some that are very coupled to the state of the database and others that are trying to, that could benefit from having it get cleaned out every time. What is your strategy for trying to help adopt a more widespread consistency within your team there, or teams and or squads, as you call them there? By going through this process and you've identified that there's tests that are coupled and half of them are, maybe half of them aren't, is there a preferred convention that you're trying to broadcast out to the wider developers on the project to be like, hey, going forward, should we be trying to do it this way? Or is there going to, so that is that something that can be addressed later on? Or is there actually some advantages to one style versus another style? Or is that just something you have to live with, knowing that there's going to be this divergent pattern?
Yeah. That's a very good point, because so I do believe that having team standards is really important. There are many levels, but at least within your team, it's super important to make these conventions explicit. And it's frequent that you realize some conventions were implicit. And when you realize that, have a quick discussion and officialize what should be the convention. And then you have that at the level of the company also, or the department. It really depends on the size of your company. But in our case, we are 4-5 teams. So we try to have conventions within our teams, and then how to spread the conventions across different teams, like this case, doing the test in this way, like following these best practices maybe. So the way we cross-pollinate this knowledge is to have, we do have something called the Best Practice Guild. So people from each team are meeting every 2 weeks or so, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was every week, but it was too much. So now they are doing that every 2 weeks. Anyone can bring up some topics like this one. So I could propose that topic, and then we discuss. So usually the person who is proposing the topic is presenting the problem, the way we do it today, or maybe the lack of consistency today, and is proposing like a solution or a convention to adopt. And then we're discussing the pros and cons of that. The main advantage being it's not to be right, because sometimes you don't really know and you have to take a bet, and it's only with experience that you will revisit that decision, but at least to agree on one way to do things. So we don't have each single developer having to take the decision by themselves, and potentially like not having that consistency creates more problem than actually agreeing on one convention.
We'll be back with our interview with Nicolas in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're finding these discussions valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. Also, do you know someone in our industry who I should be speaking with on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to Robby with a Y at maintainable.fm. And now, back to our interview with Nicolas Carlo. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about your website, understandlegacycode.com. Tell us a little bit about what it is and who the target audience is.
I'm working at BusBud, and it has been 2.5 years since I moved in Canada. And before that, I was doing consulting in Paris, in France. And before that, I used to work as a freelance developer and in a startup also. And I realized that most of my time has been spent on working on existing code base. So joining an existing team, when I was consultant, usually it was a project that was in distress, and they were calling consultants to help them get out of there. But even at BusBud, which is a startup, I joined 2.5 years ago. Most of the code base we're working with today has been written 5 years ago, by people who are not here anymore, because the turnover is around 2 years for developers, maybe 1.5 years. So that's very true for BusBud. And so most of my time is spent working on the existing code that I didn't write, that is more or less tested, more or less documented, more or less maintainable. I was really into learning how to improve my game here, like solutions to that. And I've learned a lot of things with many different people at work, but outside of work also, because I'm really into the meetups and the software crafters community. So I learned a lot of things across years. And I decided in January to set myself up to a challenge, which was to share that knowledge, which I was already doing inside BusBud, but I decided to do that more broadly. And the best way, to learn more is to teach. So to take a topic and to write about it. So I decided to do a post every single week on the many topics. Like I have a huge backlog of things I can talk about. That is around legacy code. So the audience is the target audience is people like developers who are working with existing code. And I'm defining what I call legacy code here. And my definition of legacy code is valuable code that you are not comfortable changing, or you are afraid to change. Anyone in this position is a person I want to talk to through my articles, because I'm here to share like common issues that I faced and how am I solving them today, what I know, all of the resources I've read about or listened about. And with that, I already discovered more resources, and I've met different people that taught me different, like more techniques that I didn't know before. So I'm really happy to do that.
That's great. With this particular project, are you framing it around specific programming language technologies, or is it kind of a bit more language agnostic?
Most of the articles I've posted, I try to keep them language agnostic, or I provided example in different languages, so I switched depending on the blog post. Personally, the language I'm most fluent in is like I've been doing JavaScript backend, and actually I started on the front end, but backend and front end for years, like since I started, I guess. But I also, because I was consultant, I also had to work on PHP, Python, and Ruby and Java code. So I was able to see different languages, and many issues don't really depend on the language. Of course, depending on the language, the concrete solution might be different, might look different, but many issues are not language agnostic. So I try to tackle these. And sometimes, yeah, for example, I'm using VS Code and I'm doing JavaScript, so I'm lacking a nice automated refactoring extension or capabilities at least. So I'm building that on the side, like as an open source project. So I'm building tooling also to help me, and that will be language specific or editor specific. And then I can recommend people to use whatever language tooling they have at disposal. But for the content, for the concepts, no, they don't depend on a specific language.
That's great. I just subscribed myself this last week, so I'm looking forward to getting these emails. You know, in I was reading some of the articles that you had on the site, and one of them was titled, "Where should you put the documentation?" And you touched on a number, I think a lot of things that are overlooked by teams in terms of things like making sure it's three basic principles, like is it easy to find, easy to read, and easy to write. And let's just assume that the audience understands the importance of being of finding and reading documentation. But what do you mean by easy to write?
Oh, this point is really important because I have experience, and that's especially true when the company is big or with a lot of process, that you want to find a balance between like you want to control the access of people. For example, some people might not have access to GitHub because it's a source code, and they should not change that. But people have decided to put the documentation in a wiki in GitHub. So then some people cannot update the documentation. They cannot write it. And by doing so, you're preventing yourself from having many individual contributors just tweaking it and making sure that it keeps up to date. Because documentation is really about the shared knowledge of the company, and it's constantly evolving. And you have to maintain that in a way that you should trim what is not relevant anymore or not that important. For example, you have automated something, and so it's not really important to have these steps listed anymore, or we are learning new things. So it's really important to make sure that most of the people that are belonging to your company or your team are able to change the documentation, are able to write on the documentation. It's very common to have a lot of frictions around writing, like updating the docs. If it's complex, like if it takes you more than few minutes, I would say, to change the doc, people will just stop doing it. They won't do it because it will be a too big of a commitment to do a change. For example, to fix a typo. Like it's a simple change, but if I need to clone a repo and build that locally and then change that source code and open a PR, wait for a review, well, people won't do it.
That's a good point. I'm thinking about some of those really small things, the barrier level to like I'm always curious about how teams decide where to store their documentation for certain. I got to meet a team. Oh, all of our documentation goes in this one central location. It's usually, some of it's in the repository, some of it's in the wiki, some of it's maybe some other documents that we use with our clients. Maybe it's like a Google Doc or something, who knows? And so things get spread around, or And then it's just like, well, and then there's that scenario of like, okay, we should document that. But then there's like, well, where do I document it? I have multiple choices. It's like, does it belong in the README? Does it belong in the wiki, Confluence, whatever? And then you kind of get this decision paralysis in some ways of being like, I don't know, this is taking too long. I'll come back to this later. And then you forget and you don't end up documenting it. And so it becomes this like knowledge that happens to get passed around when people hit problems. It's a tricky one. I know I've seen. And so you make a good point in terms of like, it's just like, what's the process for getting documentation changed? Does it need to go through a review process? Is like that. I think that's a good question. Like for I think teams just to think about. If we're making a change to the README file requires the time to go through multiple layers of a pull request, is it important enough for it to be there, or could you just include a link to a wiki page from your README and then know that a lot of that stuff's over there? So earlier on in the beginning when we had talked about maintainable stuff, you said like the README should include enough information to get you up and going. Where do you start to see is like information that probably doesn't need to be part of, say, the repository, but might be better fit elsewhere? Do you have some guidelines that you've kind of been working towards?
Yeah. In general, either the information is in the repository, usually in the README, or maybe in other Markdown files in the repository, or it's in a central documentation. This is how I usually recommend people to do that. And eventually iterate from that, but usually it's like if you reach that state, it's enough. The difference, like should it be in the repo or should it be in the central place, depends on is this documentation specific to this code base, to this source code or not. So in the README, I will bring instructions on how to clone this repo and have it running locally, how to do changes in this repository. Eventually, I will refer to, like if you do have conventions shared across the company on how we code, for example, like coding style conventions, say, I will put a link to the documentation that should be shared in the central thing, because it's not just for this repository. And then I will put like how to deploy eventually. Yeah, how to deploy, how to do changes, how to install and have it running locally. And that should be it. Eventually more information. That depends on what you're doing, like what you feel needs to be here. And that's a good start. Pretty much like open sources, READMEs, they usually do a good job in making sure that people can join and they have all of the information they need to get started and to do changes. And the best project I've seen out there, they have to do that, because if they don't, well, people from across the planet, they cannot contribute. So they cannot just fall back on, asking a colleague how to do that.
Hi there. Do you know someone who might be looking for assistance with their Ruby on Rails application? Planet Argon would love to meet them. We're offering a $1,000 referral bonus. Send someone our way, and if they sign up for services with Planet Argon, we'll give them a $1,000 discount. And in return, you'll get a check for $1,000 in the mail, just for knowing the right person. Hop on over to planetargon.com/referrals for more information and to refer someone our way. That's planetargon.com/referrals. Thanks.
I want to kind of circle back around to earlier talking about how your team uses GitHub issues and you have your sustainability week. Have there been approaches that you and your teams that you've been a part of, that you've tried to take that didn't work out in terms of keeping up on maintainable best practices or taking care of technical debt? Like, I don't know if you've ever done, like some people talk about they'll set aside a certain percentage of developer time specifically for that type of work. I don't know how well they're measuring if that's actually happening or not, but are there things that you've tried that you're like, that was not worth it in the end?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we have found the best recipe even for us. We're trying new things. Where we are today is that every 2 months or 3 months, like every quarter, we try to have 1 or 2 weeks of sustainability week. But also Sustainability Week is for cross-team collaboration. It's the second goal of that is to have people from different teams collaborate to do some maintenance work. Today, it's left to each individual team to decide how they want to manage that. So it depends for the different team. In my team, what we do is we always take some features, some bugs, and some maintenance tasks. So we kind of try to flag, okay, this is a new feature, this is a bug, and this is more a maintenance task. And they are all important, so we try to have a healthy mix of all of them. For example, upgrading, like keeping our dependencies up to date, it has been something that we didn't do for a long time, and now we're starting doing it in a more serious way. Yeah, we're upgrading progressively these dependencies along new features and bug fixes. But this is how my team is doing it. Other team might depend, they might dedicate a specific budget on that.
Nice. And when you mentioned, keeping up on dependencies, have you got to a point where you're using any sort of automated dependency tools at this point, like tools like Dependabot, or still kind of like manually figuring that stuff out? Not that there's a problem necessarily with manually doing that, but I know it can be a little nerve-wracking for teams that don't feel like they're ready for that automated approach.
Yeah, it's not an easy one, and it has been a question I've been thinking for a long time. I will actually probably write something about it. But so we have Dependabot to open the pull request for the vulnerability fixes, like the security issues, because we want to be aware of that. But there are many other packages that got out of date, not necessarily because of the security, but just like it has been 2 years since we're upgrading and we're maybe missing things, or maybe not, but it's easy to do a minor version upgrade than to have 2 major or 3 major versions to upgrade. So keeping everything up to date is important to be able to keep up to date and change things or bring the good stuff. I've discovered something called libyear.com. Well, you can go on libyear.com, but the thing is called libyear. It gives you a simple score, so I really like it because it's very simple. It gives you a number, a score that depends on how old are your dependencies. So, for example, if you have 1 dependencies and it's 1 year old, your score will be 1. And if you have 2 dependencies and each of them is 1 year old, your score will be 2. So you can run that on the code base very quickly just to have a sense of how bad is the out of date situation, and that could be helpful to have a simple metric just to bring the team in a habit of doing that frequently. So that will be something we will be using, and we don't need something fancy, but what needs to be done is having a process for maintaining the code base. Now, about automating it, I would love to have that automated. On personal side projects, I do have that automated. The thing is, to have that automated, you need to have you need to trust your tests. You have to have strong automated tests and to trust that. If you don't, well, it's not really about upgrading the version and doing yarn install. It's more about testing that you didn't break anything. So I cannot say that today we have a good enough test suite to automate that process, and the problem will be that it will be a lot of noise. So for the moment, we're in the process of doing it manually and getting in the habit of doing that. If we find a rhythm that is fine for us, then we will automate. Probably we'll find something like Dependabot to be less work for us. But before automating it, we will try to understand what the issue is and what will be the correct way for us to keep that up to date.
Do you find yourself more often on team rewrite or team refactor?
Usually I'm more on team refactor, and I'm not saying that there is no place for rewrite. There are moments where you do need to rewrite because it's the best thing to do, but it really depends on what is your problem and what you're trying to achieve. So to summarize my position today, if you want to change what you have you want to build something different, like something better. Usually you have learned from what you have done, and now you want to build something better, and your clients, whoever they are, they know that this is the old stuff and what you're building is the new stuff. Then a rewrite is most likely the solution. But if what you're trying to do is your thing is broken, hard to maintain, you don't really know, but your clients, they just expect you have the same thing at the end, you should better refactor. Because if you rewrite, especially if you don't know what you're rewriting that much, you will miss a lot of things. And what will happen is the client, they think they expect to use the same thing. And then a lot of cases are broken. And maybe, for example, they were depending on bugs of the old system, and you don't have any context about how you get there, but you're rewriting it, and now for the client, the thing is not working anymore. And I think, at the end, it's really about the client. Like, are your clients aware that you are building something new, and they know that, okay, this is old, and this will be new, and this will be different, but the new will be better, hopefully? Or are you trying to do that under the hood, like the client won't know? And in that case, you should not rewrite. You should really refactor instead.
Yeah, I'm always curious about when you mentioned, as you were prior to your current position, you were a freelancer, contractor. If there were points in your career, and I think reflecting on my own time in my career where taking over existing projects is pretty much all I've done for most of my career, right? And there have been those times like this needs to be rewritten, but then there's also that reality of like that sounds great and easy. Like, okay, if I could just do it my own way because I didn't build it originally. This is clunky. This just seems to be a never-ending mess of spaghetti code, and it would make my life easier if this was done the way I would do it. But you really don't often have a good grasp on what's there and why it is the way it is. You don't have that context, I think, and to map all like if in order for a rewrite to happen, here's all the features that exactly need to come over for like this, and here's all the rationale behind every decision made there. That's rarely ever documented anywhere outside of the code. And if you can't even wrap your head around that, then relying on the client to be able to explain it all to you is probably not going to be easy either, because they don't remember everything either. So I don't remember code I wrote a couple of years ago, either sometimes. So, but yeah, thanks for kind of digging in and talking about like when you think it would be beneficial to do a rewrite and versus say doing some refactoring. And if you can get a client to say yes, give you a thumbs up on a rewrite, I hope your estimates are somewhat remotely accurate, but because that's also a really good way to disappoint your client and lose confidence and trust with them. If when you take 2 to 3 times as long, you're like, sorry, I underestimated it.
It's very frequent. So well, everyone needs to be aware that a rewrite, it's not a light project at all, and it's really redoing it, but better, hopefully better. Everyone needs to be on board that we are redoing it.
Yep.
We are not just fixing it.
There's a lot of risks. So let's imagine that there's a few people listening to this episode, I hope, for people are still listening these days. They've been at their company for, say, a few years, and they don't feel like their concerns about the long-term maintainability of their code base have been heard or accepted by, the people with the budgets. Perhaps they've tried a few times to advocate for refactoring areas of the code or maybe improving the test suite, upgrading the framework, dependencies, what have you, but have heard, not right now, maybe later, a few too many times and no longer feel like it's worth asking about. What advice could you offer them on how they could start taking some action on that?
Good question. I think a lot of people are actually in this situation. I've met a lot of people in this situation, and I've been in this situation also. But I was lucky. I was with other developers who taught me better ways. In general, it's useless to go and talk to your product manager or whatever and ask them that to spend time refactoring these classes because it's not doing blah blah blah, etc. Like, they might be polite or they might have some technical background, but really it's not their job to hear that. Like, you should put yourself in the shoes of the business people that you're talking to And I think it's a really good exercise to think about it too from a business perspective. Like, why do we really want to refactor this code, for example? Is it causing a problem actually? Do you really need to change it? For example, maybe you have came across some really bad code, but you are not changing it, and it hasn't been changed in the last 6 months, so it doesn't need to be refactored, even if it's ugly. That's an example. But maybe you need to implement a feature, and it's hard to implement that feature, and you have been struggling for days because the code is not the like, it's way harder than you anticipated when you did the planning, for example, because you didn't know that part of the code base. And now it's a good time to have that discussion with the product manager, but not in terms of like technical jargon, but instead using business metaphors or business language. And it's all about, for them, it's all about a matter of cost. Does it worth it? Does it worth doing it? Like, there is the deadline, the client, the value, and there is the short-term value, the long-term value, and you need to have that clear discussion on what can be done, prior work that could make you go faster after, and you can measure that. You can agree on, okay, we're gonna spend 1 week to refactor that, but after that we will go twice faster. So in the end, we will be able to implement the feature faster than in general, or it will have long-term benefits. I usually advise people to use concrete numbers like time spent, or the if you can even get that into money, or the time spent also in bug fixing. If you have less bugs to fix, you have more time to implement new features. And finally, I would like to say that that's how we do it today. So we're quite transparent in our communication inside our team. So yes, our project manager, he knows about refactoring, and we talk about that between developers, but he is here, so he is aware of all of that. But in terms of the issues we're tackling, some of them are maintenance, but most of the refactorings happens in the features issues. So say we are implementing a cancellation plan for a specific operator, so we try a new feature and we do some shortcuts to have that. Okay, all good. And then finally it works. So we want to enable that for more operators and more use cases. But first we need to refactor and clean up the technical debt and to refactor before we can implement the feature. But this is part of implementing the feature. Like, we don't say we first need to have an issue to refactor this. We say, okay, we can do that, but it will include some refactoring work, just like it will include the fact that we write tests to code this feature. So it is part of the package. When we do estimate how much time it will take to implement this feature, we take into consideration that we will add tests, we will refactor the code. Bonus points if that's a part of the code base we don't know. That still happens. Sometimes we have to work on the part of the code base that we absolutely don't know. So in this case, we make it clear. We have never been there before. There will be unknowns, and maybe we'll come back and say, okay, we need to refactor all of this before we can do that. And by being honest here on, okay, it takes this amount of time to do the test, refactor, and implement the feature, then we can have a honest discussion on what do you need, what do you want, and how do you prioritize the work.
I think that's some really good advice there. You're thinking about like setting the scene or the prep work that needs to go before you start writing the new code to build a feature. Like, how long is it? I'm thinking about in a past part of my life, I painted houses for like 3 years before I started programming for a living. And thinking about when we'd get a request for an estimate for painting, you didn't think, well, assuming I have everything ready and I can just start putting paint directly on the wall, it'll take me an hour to paint that wall. But it's like, okay, but we got to do some paint sample colors. We got to go pick up the paint. We need to move stuff around in the living room or whatever to make space. We got to prepare the room so that we don't mess up other areas of the room. Like, that stuff takes time. Yeah. And then when I actually start slapping paint on the wall, it's going to take me an hour to do that small section or whatever, but it takes like 4 hours to do the whole thing. So I think oftentimes I hear developers see those things like writing tests or doing some refactoring as like, well, this is extra stuff, not part of the prerequisites to do the work. And I think it's like, do you need to ask a stakeholder or project manager or product owner for permission to write tests? I think is a weird way to phrase it. Whereas, like, because I think the other expectation of anyone that's paying you to work on their software is to know that you feel confident that what you've developed works. So how are you testing it? They're not saying, well, I want you to manually click around in your web browser and test this, and then ask someone else to manually go around and click around and try doing that in 2 or 3 different browsers and different devices. Please do that manually every single time. No one's asking you to do that. But that's basically the trade-off you're making when you're saying, I'm not going to write some automated tests. And obviously, automated testing doesn't cover every little edge case there, but that's the reason why we have tooling like automated testing around, is so that we can speed up things in our process, save more money in the long run, and make our lives easier. But I don't feel like we need to ask for permission as much as I think developers like to think they do. So I don't know.
Yeah. A classic mistake. So if there is one thing people can remember after this podcast, is if you find yourself at stand-up saying, I'm done, but I just need to write the test now, don't say you're done. You're not done. You like, writing the test is part of what you need to do. So whether you write the test before or after, it's up to you. But writing the test, as you said, is part of making sure that I can come back to this. I won't waste time trying to debug, or I won't break the thing and then the end user will be testing for me. They will report it doesn't work, and then I will need to come back, but like in 2 months on this. Like, it's part of the job. So you're done when it's refactored, it's implemented, it's tested, and you have shipped everything as required with the expected quality.
And is it done when it's merged in your environment?
It depends. If that's, for example, if we did use feature toggling, it is done when the feature toggling is adopted or rejected. Otherwise, you forget about them.
So with that, where can listeners best follow your thoughts on software development online?
Yeah, well, the simplest way for people to follow me will be to go on understandlegacycode.com, and from here they will find my Twitter, and they can subscribe to my mailing list. And if I have any further project, I will post it here. So understandlegacycode.com, join me here, and if you want to get in touch, usually Twitter is the best way to reach me out.
Excellent. Well, it's been such a delight having you on Maintainable, Nicolas. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Robby.
Maintainable.